So, yeah, we'll talk more about these things, but, if you use GPS at all, like I have on occasion, half the time it actually is not, it doesn't actually help me get there. It's much better for me to rely on my wife. And I wrote in my autobiography, if I can just keep my mouth shut, I'll usually get where I go if I just do what she says. Unfortunately, I can't always do that, and so we get lost in it. Anyway, our next speaker is Daryl Charles. Now, this is a very courageous man who's walking in the lion's den because he's going to challenge vigorously the way Jacques Ellul approaches ethics. And he's got Jacob Marquez Wallace and Ellul's ethics translator, and Lisa the translator, and me. I've made a life of being a kind of a little curmudgeon in ethics. So glad to have you here, Daryl. Now, let me just say, Daryl, I've gotten to know. I've known about his work over the years, but I hadn't really read much until I was teaching a class on Ecclesiastes, and I noticed he had a new book on Ecclesiastes. I was reading Ellul's Reason for Being, which was really fascinating. But I have a confession to make. Daryl's book is much better than Ellul's, and Ellul thought this was his best thing. And it was great. It's prophetic, challenging, but Daryl has written a magnificent book on the Old Testament Jewish book of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, this kind of thing. And then Daryl came out with a book recently on our secular work, which is a kind of philosophy, theology of work, which is a huge part of my career over the years. And I immediately put it on my top 10 list all time. So, Daryl, it's wonderful to have you here. He's an independent scholar, and he's also, he works with the Acton Institute and the John Jay Institute. Come up here, Daryl, and tell us about Ellul. I could try.
I would be grateful. Thank you. Yeah, there's a one-pager coming your way to help you follow the skeleton of my thinking. And I greatly look forward to the question and answer time afterward. At professional meetings, that's always the best part, isn't it? It really is. And it's an honor to follow Ken today. It's an honor to have David sharing. And thank you for the kind comments. My children should have been here. I mean, where are they when you need them? They needed to hear them. Okay. All right. Well, let me just say preliminarily, too, my introduction to Jacques Ellul came at the tail end of graduate school. I quite by accident stumbled upon The Humiliation of the Word. Wow. And was stunned. I was studying philosophical hermeneutics at the time, and so I was struck by this mix of sociological, theological, legal, and cultural criticism that you don't often find in standard Christian circles. And I just appreciated that so much. So that was the beginning. That was about the time that Neil Postman's book on the triumph of the image came out, right? You all are familiar with that. And so there's a shared burden there between these two individuals. Well, I'm going to start with part 2 on your outline, if you care to follow along. My own view is that the conference theme, given the importance and the complexity and the scope of technology, cries out for a partner theme. And I was stunned, I guess you could say, when I read through the technology trilogy. By the way, Ellul wrote not one, but 2 trilogies. Maybe there are 5 out there, and some are yet to be translated, Jacob. But the second one is an ethics trilogy. So he had a lot to say about that. That is going to be the focus of the next couple minutes. And I'm going to take 2 of those 3 works, To Will and To Do, and the theological foundation of the law. So I appreciate so much the complementarity of our presentations here. Thank you, David, for constructing things in that way. And I look forward to our combined question and answer period afterward. By the way, my own background, I did criminal justice research. I was serving as doing basic research and serving as a theological advisor to a little-known convict by the name of Charles Colson. at Prison Fellowship back in the 80s and 90s. And so that was my baptism into criminal justice after I completed graduate school. I wasn't looking for it. It came out of the blue, so to speak. Theology was more my background, but I ended up doing that. These were years that really were transformative for me working in Washington, D.C. And then after that, there was a shift in my own thinking and toward international issues of war and peace, rather than domestic justice. And that combined really informs my own personal interest in the ethics of Ellul, just by way of context. At the outset of our discussion here this afternoon, I want to say this. One particular element of Ellul's work is striking, and this needs stating before we consider his trilogy, or two of the three, on ethics. Utterly remarkable is the fact that any discussion of ethics or morality in the technology trilogy is absent. Now you're going to say, well, Daryl, you're exaggerating. No, I thought, well, I missed it, I bypassed it, so I undertook a reread of his trilogy. And neither Society, nor System, nor Bluff has a chapter or a subheading devoted to the question of ethics or morality. And only in Society did I find three places out of 449 pages. And these are mentions in passing of morality and ethics. So to me, at least, the absence of any discussion of ethics or morality in the technology trinity is the first thing that strikes the serious reader. A second feature to which much, not all, but much of my presentation for the next couple minutes, as David already insinuated, is devoted, concerns Ellul's adamant rejection of natural law thinking in his understanding of ethics. And this stubborn resistance, if I may say that, is bountifully on display in two of the works, a summary of which I'm going to give you in the next minute or two, To Will and To Do and the Theological Foundation of Law. Part 3, if you're following along. According to the volume's foreword, To Will and To Do represents Ellul's major treatise on Christian ethics, and it uses an approach that's described in the foreword as dogmatically Christocentric. Interesting. That's important. At the outset, Ellul confesses to be neither a theologian nor a philosopher, and I think that's both praiseworthy and it's also necessary for reasons that have been already laid out here in this conference, as well as by Ken admirably. And then following that, Ellul states this, and I'm quoting, "I shall take care not to give a definition of ethics." Now, such a statement strikes the reader as a bit strange, even jarring, if for not less than, I can think of three reasons. One, his training in law, yes, about which we just heard. Two, his publishing of an ethical trilogy. And three, his profession as a Christian. All three of those, I would think, would demand, at least in a willingness, to have some definitional understanding of ethics. Much like the theologian Karl Barth and their contemporaries, and you don't have to do much reading in Ellul to realize he's not dependent on, but yeah, he's cooperating with, and in a certain way, he is dependent on Barth's extreme antithesis, his utter opposition between reason and revelation. And this accent on the strict antithesis or opposition between the two is perhaps best explained, in my view, by the era in which they live. What is that? Both of them are fighting against tyranny, yes? Both of them are confronted with a totalitarian spirit in their time. Ellul, it will be remembered, was dismissed from what? He was dismissed from his professorial duties at the university in Vichy puppet France, was he not, 1940? And of course, Barth was instrumental in crafting what? The Barmen Declaration of 1934, which was a statement basically representing the quote-unquote confessing church in its conflict, and I think the conflict accurately can be depicted as both within and without the church, at least in Germany, and a response to that. The radical break between revelation and reason, however, placed and places Ellul at odds, not only with Catholic thought. You don't have to be Catholic to appreciate that reason is associated with and important in its cooperation with revelation and faith. But it also places him at odds with the Reformed tradition in which he stood. And later I'll probably mention, or at least in the question and answer period, all of the magisterial reformers advocated natural law thinking. Not one magisterial reformer took up the other side. Yes, Protestant Reformed leaders had great disputation and utter opposition, perhaps, on issues relating to justification, right? Unmerited favor, grace, that sort of thing. But on the issue of natural law ethics, they were one with their Catholic contemporaries. Well, Ellul begins to do and to will with the knowledge of the good, and he argues that it depends. Knowledge of the good in the human being depends on divine revelation and what he calls the will of God. Outside of direct revelation by God, no knowledge of any good can exist. Any natural knowledge of what is good, he insists, is impossible. These are his words. Adam had no knowledge of the good or evil, he states. Prior to that moment of the fall, recorded in Genesis 3, there was no moral conscience. Human beings live in a moral universe only after or since the fall. Now, maybe it sounds like I'm nitpicking here, or splitting, what's the metaphor? Yes, but I'm not. I think that's crucial. It's crucial. Accordingly, Ellul believes all human morality is constructed in human separation from God due to the fall, and hence any attempts at constructing a morality is in opposition to God the Creator. Quote, in Scripture there is no possible knowledge of the good apart from a living and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Close quote. So there's no normative ethics of the good. Question I want to raise is, what about Melchizedek? Or what about the garden pre-Genesis 1? Genesis 2, we read of the knowledge of what? Good and evil. As a test, is it not? Now, okay, that aside, what about human design? What is the nature of the image of God alluded to by Ken in the human person, and how is it mirrored in a biblical theology of creation? Ellul declares himself sure, that's his word, not mine, that the imago Dei, that is the image of God in each person, whatever it is, I'm citing him here, those are his words, cannot be composed of moral conscience. He asserts categorically, quote, nowhere in the Bible do we see a human nature affirmed, and it is a mistake to say that this image of God is a nature for man. Yes, there is a nature, but it is a natural order of, say, biology, ecology, yes, chemistry. There is no natural morality. You probably sense where that's going to go in his thinking. Hence, there is no such thing as natural law, no intuition of a basic moral law that might inform human beings at a fundamental level of good and evil. As the church mistakenly, he believes, that's his argument, the church has mistakenly tried to establish and then teach natural law thinking through the centuries. So Ellul rejects the traditional Christian natural law understanding of St. Paul in Romans 2. Do you recall what's on tap there? Wherein the apostle speaks of the moral law written on the heart. Do you recall that? The law written on the heart for both the Jew and the Gentile. That is, he's speaking in universal terms. There are no universal and shared aspects of morality in the created order for Jacques Ellul. Now, on the one hand, as he moves toward the conclusion of to will and to do, Ellul argues for the impossibility of a Christian ethic. That's the title of not the penultimate, I believe it's the second from last chapter in the book. He rejects the church's attempt throughout history to teach or erect a Christian morality. For this reason, then, he writes, we need not study the Christian ethic of Augustine, Ambrose, Calvin, Luther, or others. And he's adamant here, and I'm citing, the Christian life is not morality. In fact, he can declare Christianity is an anti-morality. I'm not sure how to unpack that, but that's him speaking. On the other hand, despite the impossibility of a Christian ethic, in the final chapter of the book, then Ellul describes what he calls as the necessity of a Christian ethic. So here the reader is in tension. The reader is confronted with a conclusion that seems to contradict Ellul's logic up to this point. As Christians, in his view, we cannot escape the need for a, let's call it, relatively or situational or conforming ethic, Christian ethic, even when, in theory, according to him, it's impossible to teach and establish. Okay, now to the theological foundation of law, the second work in the Trinity. While To Will and To Do might be considered his introduction to Christian ethics and perhaps his most important work, I would argue that theological foundation of law, in fact, is the most significant, given several factors, several of which were alluded to by Ken. He earned a doctorate in law. He then taught law until he was fired for his views on Nazism. And the very fact, I would argue, number three, his preoccupation with politics and sociology of law throughout his many writings. Can we agree on that? And that invites, or those factors, it seems to me, invite us to scrutinize his understanding of law, and in particular, his firm rejection of natural law thinking. Natural law, Ellul believes, is, and I'm citing him here, a 2,500-year old problem that has never really been solved. He acknowledges something, yes, of a natural law revival going on in his day among Christian proponents. However, he rejects natural law as an effort at reconciliation that's located beyond revelation and grace. Reason and natural theology, he insists, are attempts to escape the radical necessity of revelation. The scriptures do not know of law in the proper sense of the term, and I was intrigued by Ken's comments. He writes, he says, it's illusory, that's his word, to believe that human laws depend on natural law. God's law must be revealed law, and hence cannot be natural law. Law, then, he concludes, is entirely Christocentric. And of course, that, as I tried to raise the question a couple minutes ago, where does that leave all those before Christ? Yes. Was there any knowledge of good and evil? If not, what do we do with the laws? What do we do with the Torah? What do we do with the laws given to the covenant, the Old Testament covenant people of Israel? And I would ask this as well. What do we do with the Ten Commandments? Several times he alludes in these two works to the Ten Commandments, and on each occasion, Ellul is either evasive or tends to be dismissive of the Ten Commandments, unable to cite that they are universal in their normativity and their knowledge and their applicability. As I have already noted, Ellul is very critical of the church. Even Calvin, in whose Reformed tradition he stands, in her attempts, that is, the church's attempts, to teach and affirm natural law reasoning. And in the end, as Ellul sees it, to believe that the natural law was created by God, making it part of nature, and this is his problem, how we understand nature, and part of creation, betrays a serious error. Nowhere in biblical revelation is there any mention made of this law, he says, quote, and where a Christian interpretation of natural law does appear, it is an adulteration of God's word through human reason. Part 4, an evaluation. Boy, am I flying. I could say a lot more, but I'll let you say it instead. My general assessment of Ellul's writings leads me to elicit both, yes, David captured it, high praise and some repudiation. As noted at the outset, and as this conference demonstrates, there is, yes, a timeless, shall we say, timeless quality to Ellul's cultural criticism that makes us all marvel and makes us want to give application. It's persuasive, it's penetrating, is it not? And this certainly is, in the technology trilogy, it really deserves unyielding praise. At the same time, I must agree with one thoughtful reader, who I believe is in the room, who has translated Ellul, serving on the board, I believe, who not long ago said, some parts of Ellul's works are, and I'm citing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, unhelpful, unnecessarily abrasive, and perhaps better left without rediscovering. Close quote. Put the stones down, okay, if you would. Thank you. Now, certainly not all, but a fair amount of the material in Ellul's Ethics trilogy, okay, I'm confining my critique there too, needs adjustment, and in some instances, severe adjustment. And perhaps because of his deep distrust of the church, historically, he's something of an outlier. Yes, it's true that he was involved locally. Yes, it was true that he was involved in his parish. But he was nevertheless something of an outlier in the Reformed Church. He was convinced that he need not operate under the assumptions of the fathers of the church, of whom he is very critical in his writings. This wariness of the historic Christian tradition, I would argue, does not serve him well when he's doing theology. And even though he says, I'm not a theologian, do I need to be here? Forgive me. Even though I'm not a philosopher, that doesn't prevent him from doing a lot of philosophizing and theologizing and what have you. It seems to me that part of the safeguard for those of us who intend to work within the wider Christian tradition is that this very tradition helps guide us and protect us from false assumptions and erroneous applications. The historic Christian tradition, quote unquote, and the Christian moral tradition, quote unquote, are so named not because all voices within agree. We have charitable knockout squabbles, do we not? And some of them are necessary theologically. Rather, the historic Christian tradition demarcates what is authentically Christian and what is not. These boundaries are established. Can we say that? The historic Christian tradition, the Christian moral tradition, establishes boundaries within which to work. But because Ellul has a low view, and it sounds like I'm being hypercritical, no, I'm just making an observation. I'm not trying to be critical. Because of that low view of the tradition, he very often steps outside of the boundaries of the Christian tradition, which he claims to represent. To illustrate, against Ellul, Jesus affirmed both the law and the prophets. Jesus does it several times. Against Ellul, in addition, Christian faith is about morality. I read that outlandish piece of it. It's not about morality. In fact, Christianity is anti-morality. Balderdash. At the very least, the Epistle of James reminds us human works have intrinsic meaning. That is to say, not what we say, not what we profess, I've heard that again and again at this conference. I don't think that's heresy. It's true. And guess what? They're decisive, they're intrinsically valuable, not only in this life, but for all of eternity. And then finally, not least, the natural law is, against Ellul, central to Christianity. Indeed, to the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. Ellul's frequent repudiations notwithstanding. Precisely so, because it does serve as a bridge. I'm a Protestant. I'm not Roman Catholic. But I became, doing criminal justice research in Washington, I became a proponent of natural law thinking because I realized that is a tool that must be in our toolbox. It bridges Christians and non-Christians. It doesn't mean that we dispense with revelation, and that's one of his great fears. But rather, God works through external and internal means. Theologians call this what? General and special revelation, right? So that's what St. Paul is doing in Romans 1 and 2. He's pointing to the wonder of the cosmos and saying, all people know. And then after that, he points to the law written in the heart. All people know. Now, do they know all things? No, that's not the argument. But they know a minimum of good and of evil. That's the image of God, I would argue, against Ellul. So, now to several specific matters, and then I'm going to open it up to you. One factor, I think, that's central to Ellul's theological and ethical understanding is his radical, and I would argue, deficient understanding of creation and fall. And I think you've heard me insinuate that in the last couple minutes. Ellul writes, and I'm citing him here, whatever it is of the imago Dei which survives the fall, that cannot in any case be the moral sense. Therefore, no one can have any knowledge of God or the good, that is to say, what ought to be done. But ladies and gentlemen, Christian theology historically has taught that while the image of God, the imago Dei, yes, is tarnished, it's not eliminated. It has not been removed. It has not been obliterated. And the implication of that truth is that law, morality, politics, and governing authorities, hey, our discussion during these 2 days so far of politics and law has been awful. It's been negative. I'm not saying there's no need for critique, but I think we need to be careful. That's a high calling. Those who are called to the study of law, to the practice of law. What would happen if all Christian influence left? I like David's comments in the plenary session, the last hour. And that's a tendency, not just of Mennonites and Amish and Hutterites. Those who are fed up, those who are angry, those who are disenchanted. Disengagement. And we're called to do just the opposite. And I don't fault Ellul for that. I agree that he did believe that we needed to be in the public square arguing. Though I, like several of the speakers have suggested, I think he's often very vague and abstract. So God works through general revelation, okay? And we don't want to reject the fact that God works or mediates his ways through the general, through the external. That's grace too, yes? Not just direct revelation through Jesus Christ. That's the ultimate expression thereof, yes. But general revelation goes with and complements special. And I say this, as I mentioned before, having done criminal justice research in D.C. I could not have worked and I could not serve there if I believed what Jacques Ellul believed theologically in severing redemption from creation and only anchoring things in his Christocentrism. There must be something that is eternal, woven into the fabric of the very created order. Another very basic assumption that undergirds Ellul's ethical writings is the belief that Christianity, with its accent on revelation and grace, is to be accepted on terms that are internal and not on terms that are external to it. I've already noted that, and what the distinction between general and special revelation means. Romans 1 and 2 are a good example of that. And the interaction of nature and grace has important implications, as I've been preaching, have I not? Right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. I've heard a lot about just and unjust in these sessions thus far in these 2 days. These are moral values that have intrinsic character. And for this reason, natural law thinking is vital. So with Thomas Aquinas, we understand the natural law at its most basic level as good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. And if we reject that basic assumption, we cut ourselves off at the knees. Finally, I'm simply going to take note so that we have enough time to talk. I'll eliminate most of Part 4 and Part 5. On the back of your handout, if you haven't noticed it, what I've done, given Ellul's adamant rejection of natural law thinking, I've just copied a number of texts and narratives there that are evidence of the opposite, and they are there for your consideration. That the moral law, which is reflecting God's character, what Thomas Aquinas called the eternal law, is evidenced here and there throughout Scripture. Often it's implicit, that's true. Sometimes it's explicit. I like what Paul does, and herewith I'll stop, at the Areopagus, when he's dragged before this presidium of 30 elite educated men, among whom Cicero sat in Athens. And what does he do? He does natural law thinking to engage them. Guess what he doesn't do? He doesn't cite the Old Testament scriptures, does he? That would have been meaningless to these educated pagans, Gentiles. What he does do is operate on the basis of creation, wisdom of two of their poet philosophers who are well known to the city. And he uses that, builds on that. Now, he doesn't just stop there, yes, and he turns the corner and says, yes, this one who you reject, who you mock, he in fact is the governor of the universe, and he will judge us one day. He ends up there. But I think it's important that even St. Paul, who is called, by the way, the apostle to the Gentiles for a reason, engages in natural law thinking. Therewith I conclude. Again, I want to say thank you to David for chairing our session. Thank you to Ken for preceding me. And thank you in advance for your questions and comments.
I would say as a lifelong student and professors, wouldn't you love to have a guy like this as your professor? I mean, really, Daryl, you're just so live and so organized and so challenging. I just love the way you present your stuff, even when it's wrong. I'm just kidding. But one of the things to think about in Ellul's context, here he is, nurtured in the earlier part of the 20th century, coming out of 19th century optimism and reason and science and all of that, and he's like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. He's going to attack modernity as having this confidence in human reason that we can spell out the rules for achieving progress and all that. And so he's he's unlike Nietzsche, who's a nihilist who destroys and leaves people kind of with the death of God. He's like Kierkegaard. And so you remember how Kierkegaard stages on life's way. First there's the aesthetic stage of the person who lives for good tobacco and pleasure and all that. But then there's the ethical stage, where people live and conform to the rules of life and all that. But there's another stage Kierkegaard talks about, the religious stage, and he illustrates it with Abraham's sacrifice. That yes, it's against the law to kill somebody, especially your kid, but God is above the law. And we are in relationship to a commander more than to commands. And we have confidence in that commander. And that's kind of what's going on with Ellul when he is blasting away at confident legalisms or rationally understanding that. But I wonder if today, with the triumph of postmodernism and people doing everything what they want to do in front of their screen, would he not begin to talk more about community? And, we don't know. But he was a man, he was a prophet in his times. I think that's one thing. But now I'm going to go on your side and say I really agree with where you're going on this, Daryl. And one thing that really changed me was not the philosophers, but working with business people. And the reason is, I love the Decalogue. I've written a book on the Ten Commandments, and I really do think these are 10 principles of freedom, justice, and love for the world, for humanity. These are the 10 words on freedom, how to be free, and how to find what's right and just in the eyes of the God who created everybody in every culture. And they're also the 10 words on love. And so, believing that, I start thinking, when I'm teaching MBA students, how can I communicate this to my MBA students? And when I'm doing consulting for companies on building an ethics program, I figure out how can I teach this? How can I convey this? And I have a book down there on the table called It's About Excellence, Building Ethically Healthy Organizations, in which I have illustrations in there on how I teach the Decalogue without people knowing it. But what happened to me, and I'm going to stop with this, Daryl, is when I would do this to business folk or to my MBA students, they would say, where did you get this? Where did you get these? And I would say, well, I got these ideas from a very famous piece of literature in the world. That's my basic structure, okay? And what do you think it is? I say, what do you think it is? And they would just be confused, and they'd say, the Declaration of Independence? Apparently that's what they said. And I would say, no, it's the Ten Commandments. These are the principles embedded. And so when I saw my students, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, whatever they were, they would mostly resonate and say, I think you're right. I would say, here's my 10 ideas. They're not really mine. But here are 10 ideas. What do you think? Is there an 11th idea, or do I have to take 2 out? Sometimes they'd have a couple other things they'd want to add on. But you know, it's amazing. And so I would see people from all backgrounds resonate with that, and that reaffirmed the kind of things I was discovering from Scripture itself, like you showed us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to make the speech, but you know,
well,
I got the floor.
Building upon what he's saying, though, that's what I think makes C.S. Lewis, that's why he retains such popularity, generation to generation. He does this very thing that David is describing. Not with businessmen, but he does it with the intellectually curious. Does he not? All you have to do is read the first chapter of Mere Christianity. What's the title of it? Right and Wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe.
Yes, exactly.
Wow! Wait a minute. That needs some qualification, does it not? Well, so he meets people on their level, and basically the gist of that first essay is to, of course, these are radio broadcasts before they came in print, but what he does then, he basically leads the reader to the point, and he asks questions like this. Why is it that everyone reacts negatively when injustice is done to them? What's his response? It's almost as if there's a moral law in the universe. And then he takes the next step, and of course the rest of the book and his other writings do this, leading to Christianity. But he then deduces out of that, if there's a moral law that governs the universe, of which, knowledge of which all people seem to have, and that's the reason why he uses his concept of the Tao, the abolition of man, right, and elsewhere, right? That which can't be denied. So, not that all agree, but there is this moral code among all peoples, the Tao, right?
How would you don't believe in law, you don't believe there's any moral law, there's nothing, there's no God, nothing. But how are you going to feel if I publish your research under my name, or if I steal your girlfriend? You know, how are you going to feel about that? Anyway, who has a comment or a question? Yes, sir.
So I teach philosophy of religion on occasion. I teach Ellul's subversion of Christianity, which that very strong message of Christianity is in. And I'm doing it in juxtaposition with natural law discussions as well, right? So just to get it, it's not by itself. Okay. But I guess part of my question is about Ellul's thinking, since it's also clear in Ellul, and we talked about this earlier in David's learning session elsewhere, he has this idea of nature being connected with necessity, right? The natural necessity, right? Nature, and I think he's looking at the Greeks, right? Thinking about Plato, thinking about how nature is used as a kind of source of faith and necessity. And so I guess my question is, for Ellul, the relationship between natural law and nature as a source of necessity, right? That may have led him to this very strong sense that Christianity is anti-morality, anti-natural law. Just want your impression.
What was going on in Germany? What was going on in much of the Western world? And its roots had made their way here to North America too at that time. What was going on? What did nature mean? What did National Socialism understand by nature, and how was it being applied? I have a wife, and I want to hear your answer. I'm married to a German citizen. Not one by extraction. My wife is German. We met near Montreal in 1979, married in the States, but spent our first 4 years living in what was still, at that time, West Germany. So the wall was not down yet. She has difficulty being parts of these discussions. It hurts. She's 2 generations removed. What was going on at the time? Nature meant we dispose of those that are unfit. Do you recall Ellul, though he'll allude to the Holocaust, I never recall him describing Menschenunwürdigkeit or Lebensunwürdigkeit, literally life not worth living. So this led what? Yeah, to the elimination of those who were unfit, unworthy of what they understood to be life. This is part of course, their racist, biological, genetic understanding of the human person. So nature, back to your question, I think, had very negative implications. Therefore, for someone like Jacques, who was fired for his views against Nazism when he was teaching in Vichy, France, that was very important. So there I have to temper my criticisms of him, because if I'm living in that day and I'm in his shoes, I'm probably struggling with these things myself. And it's understandable. And I think for Karl Marx too.
They could see the cruelty of actually animal life and, disease and all that kind of thing. So that's why I mentioned to Justine, he, in that article, Nature, Technique, and Artificiality, I believe he says Christians believe in creation, not in nature. And there's a kind of difference. And of course, you could believe it in natural law or in the natural law in the heart without committing yourself to believing that all nature is good and represents the will of God. Jake, I want you to say something about this because you've been working so deeply in Ellul's ethics.
I'd love to. First, thank you. I want to repeat some of the things David said. I love, first of all, that you voluntarily came to openly criticize David.
Yes, and welcome back anytime.
Yeah, exactly. And second, I also love precisely how animated you are. I think I love it. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot I could say. I'll probably, I'll wait till my talk to clarify some of my reading of his ethics in general. But one of the things I do want to pick up on is that last point, that to really understand what he's doing is, I think you need the context. So especially with the ways you were emphasizing how he's kind of departing from his own Reformed tradition. The Reformed Church in France at the time had already they split at the end of the 19th century because pastors couldn't affirm the resurrection and refused to. And so in the Reformed Church that Ellul is a gadfly in, most of the pastors, they had kind of come together in the middle of the 20th century. But half the pastors said, we'll only do it if we're not forced to teach the resurrection of Christ. Because they wanted to have nothing to do with that. So there's this context in which it's so radically, and so this is what I mean when I say, I think in terms of the big Christian tradition establishing parameters, I think this is also a North American, a common criticism of Barth, because in the European context, if you want to talk about the resurrection today, Barth is about the only seriously acceptable way to do it. Most of them, if you talk about the resurrection in any kind of academic setting, they'll just, it's nonsense. There's no discussion. But at least with Barth, they'll pay some attention to, though perhaps less and less in some circles. But I think I have two other main comments. Just one is, so there is now, this is newish. There's a second volume of Tool and To Do that was, late discovered. And the reason I mention it is because in it, he, so in, seeming contradiction with what he does in the first volume, he argues we must find a way, we cannot discard anything from the Old Testament law. We have to find a way to translate the entirety of it into the Christian ethic. And so it develops some of that. And then the only other thing, and this comment I wanted to make after Ken's talk too. So Ken, I was impressed that, so there's now in French in the last 3 years, I think there's a philosophy of law text from Ellul. And it's one of these texts that's cobbled together by former students of his from both his original stuff from the family archive and then also from students' notes when they had him. And it's, I was going to say, can you manage to describe almost everything in that volume without having read it? So I was very happy.
Well, I actually did read.
Oh, you did? Okay.
No, but I didn't.
I didn't realize.
say this to talk about technology. I told David this. I ordered it on my Kindle, and then I downloaded each page into Google Translate. And then each page was translated, and then I bound it all together in a book. So it's a serviceable translation. I mean, I'm not a French scholar or anything, but it was interesting to do it that way. And so I really read that carefully for this.
Okay, that helps a lot. The only thing I want is, sorry, I'm making this too long. Just emphasizing Ken's the 5 stages thing that Ken mentioned, how it continually changes and how he views it. And then the last note is he often says that the Greeks were horrible jurists, but great philosophers, and the Romans were amazing jurists and horrible philosophers. And it's clear which camp he chose. So in terms of his conception of law, anyway, that's
Okay.
But thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, yes. Anybody else want to say something
Yeah,
on
sorry.
Jack with question?
Yeah, we just got like 2 minutes, but put stuff on the table that we can discuss as we leave here. So, Lisa.
I'll just say I 100% agree with everything you said, and I'm so glad you said it, because
Lisa, wow.
I've tried to read some of Ellul's biblical stuff, and I'm just like, no way. Like, and so anyway, you said it a little better than I possibly could.
gosh.
The only thing I wonder about is Ellul's distinction between morality and ethics, so they're not just synonyms. And I wonder if a little bit of the critique you made didn't interpret those words like he
Right.
intended. That would be my only question. But in any case,
Thanks.
that's just
Yeah.
a little comment.
And that was not done at all. You're absolutely right. And,
Yeah, and Daryl, I mean, when I read that in Twillen 2 years ago, I just totally disagree with that. But what I would say is he's an author, and he can stipulate meanings as he wishes. But this is not historically or etymologically or philosophically justified. He could say this is technological morality, but etymologically, you might as well say this is technological ethics. Morality terms come from Latin, Greek terms from Greek, and they're all about right and wrong, obligation. It's the same subject matter, and I've just seen this over and over again in my career teaching in this field, and so it's not helpful for him. And he does this many times. He stipulates the difference between Satan, which is the Hebrew name, and devil, which is the Greek translation of Satan. He stipulates differences between kingdom of heaven and kingdom of God, and so. But you have to give authors the freedom to do that. It's just when they attribute that to a source like the Gospels, that's different than in this case where he stipulates in order to try to make a point. But so I just think when we read him, we have to read him in context. That doesn't mean we accept what he says. It means we listen and learn from a prophetic voice, and then we try to do it better, I think. That's kind of how I look at this. So he's been a huge influence on me, even though I really am closer to you on an awful lot of these things.
I wanted to say, not to steal his thunder, I'm going to hang around here if anybody just wants to talk.
Yeah.
I've got, so we're always under time constraints, but the wonderful thing is that we're free to have conversations for 3 days. That's wonderful. Secondly, I wanted to thank David and Ken again, and Jake, I'm assuming you're part of that too, because of the health problems of this Ted Lewis. More than enough was on his plate. He stepped in from, Boulder, Colorado, and took up logistical hassles like finding lodging for those of us who were driving in from out of town, which was nightmarish, and Jake, you probably were part of it too, so I just wanted to say publicly thank you to them for that, as well as for just the joy of being invited here and being with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Let's give him applause.